Hello, fellow book lovers, both readers and writers. I am Matty Dalrymple. I'm the author of the Ann Kinnear Suspense Novels and Suspense Shorts and the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers. And I also write, speak, consult, and podcast on the writing craft and the publishing voyage as the indie author. And you can find out more about me at mattydalrymple.com and at theindyauthor.com. And this is my video series, What I Learned, where I ask authors 2 questions related to their latest book. What did they learn from that book that they'd like to share with their fellow authors? And what did they learn from that book that they'd like to share with their fellow readers? And today I am here with Karen Shughart. Hey, Karen, how are you doing?
Hi there.
To give our viewers a little bit of background on you, Karen Shughart is the author of the maritime-themed Edmund DeCleryk cozy mystery series from Cozy Cat Press. All the books in this series have historical subplots and recipes prepared by the sleuth's wife, Annie. Karen is a member of the North American chapter of the Crime Writers Association of the UK, AllAuthor, Hometown Reads, and Rochester Reads, and she and her husband live in a village on Lake Ontario, the prototype for the setting of her books. And you can see a little bit of the background of her lovely home behind her in the video. And her latest book is Murder at Freedom Hill, an Edmund DeCleryk mystery, book 3. And so today I am asking Karen the 2 What I Learned questions, and I'm starting out with, Karen, what did you learn from that book that you'd like to share with your fellow authors?
It's interesting that you asked that question for this particular book because it was really the hardest one for me to write. The first one was a little difficult because it was my first. The second one, I felt like I just sort of got it. This book was very hard to write, and let me tell you why and what I learned as the result of it. The first thing is that I try to write a book every 2 years. That's per my publisher's hope. And I've been pretty good. The first one was 2018. The second one was 2020. And my goal was 2022, but they're usually published in the spring. In the middle of my starting to write it, we had the pandemic, we had an election, we had all this upheaval in our world and in our country, and my own family was going through a lot of different crises. We had 2 deaths. Each one of us, my husband and I each lost a sibling. We had some serious health problems. My husband had eye surgery. I mean, it just kept on. I felt like a punching bag, one of those clowns that you give your kids if they feel angry and you say, punch it, and it'll bounce right back. That's how I felt. And every time I'd start to pick up and start to write, there would be another interruption. And then we adopted a rescue dog from a puppy mill. Adorable. She's on some of my promotional stuff. Adorable little dog with lots of health issues. And sadly, we had to put her down last August, and I'm still grieving for her.
Oh,
but so she took up a lot. Yeah, she took up a lot of time. Not that we would ever regret. We knew what we were getting when we got her. So my writing was very sporadic. And that was very difficult because I was so distracted that I just couldn't concentrate on writing the book. Once I started writing the book, writing for me can be very meditative, but then I would start to get into it so much that I would write like 6 and 7 hours a day because I felt like I was behind schedule, even though my publisher said it's not a problem. I understand what you're going through. And I was so intent on doing that I actually started having some eye problems. I mean, I just never got off the computer. But after finishing this book now, what I learned is not to push. I mean, my publisher was fine with the delay and have the confidence that the book is going to be written, even if I don't write every day or 6 or 7 hours a day. It can take longer. The ultimate goal is to finish the book. And I think about some writers. I mean, one of my favorites is Elizabeth George, and she doesn't write a book quickly at all. Sometimes it's 3 years. So I learned that's okay. You really don't. And I'm on the 4th book right now, and I'm just giving myself time to stop and smell the roses and figure, I know it'll get done, but it doesn't have to get done immediately and now. The other part of my not writing quickly or not writing this book quickly is I'm actually not a very fast writer. I worked as a journalist and in PR for a while. And if you know anything about that, if you're writing a newspaper article, you have to be very succinct. And even in PR, you're writing press releases, you're doing sound bites, you're doing all kinds of things. So you have to be very spare with words. And I, as such, am almost compelled, or at times very compelled, to make sure that every word I use has some meaning. And that's back to my old background. So I sometimes agonize over a word, and the word might be perfectly okay. And my husband sometimes says it has to be good enough. But
Yeah.
for me, sometimes it's not. And it takes a lot longer because I'm such a wordsmith. And I'm kind of OCD about it, actually, and I will admit that. So what happens usually is my first drafts are way too short because of what I'm used to writing. And the first one especially was 20,000 words. My publisher likes 60 to 70. I'm usually in the high 60s, low 70s, 1,000. So what I had to also do, and what I've learned, and more with this book, and I'll tell you why, because I did a subplot with this book too. Now, all my books have subplots in terms of there's an historical component that links the crime to something that happened in history, but I decided to actually develop a second related subplot. And that helped a bit with expanding the story. But what I've learned is how to expand a story without packing it with too much filler. I'm sure we've probably all read books that are 500 pages long, and you're reading the book and you're thinking, I really don't need all this description, or, I don't need to know every little bite they took for breakfast. And it's all to fill it to make up pages. And I don't want to be that type of a writer. I don't think my publisher wants me to be that type of writer. So what I learned was how to really think through the story and make sure that everything that's in it actually has something to do with the story and is not filler and is not extraneous.
Well, I wanted to jump in for a second because I wanted to ask you about you were describing all the things you were dealing with when you were working on book 3. Do you feel like book 3 ended up having a different tone, like a darker tone than the earlier ones because of those things that were going on in your life?
That's a really good question. I don't know that it had a darker tone, but I have a darker feeling about it. When I finished the first 2 books, I read through them and I cried at the end. And it was not only relief, it was kind of pride in what I had accomplished. And with this book, when I finished it, I was just glad. And I didn't get as emotionally involved with this book as I did the other 2. And I think it's because of everything that was going on. But what I learned from that is when I submitted it to my publisher, I was very nervous because I didn't think I had done my best. It was, for me, there was a lot of just starting and not doing it. And I felt it was very disjointed. And my beta readers loved it. I submitted it to my publisher, anxious as can be. And within a week, she got back to me and said, Brava, this is your best ever.
Oh, wow.
And yeah. And, I just never felt like it was my best ever. And I think it was my state of mind. I don't know that the book is any darker than the others. My books aren't dark. Subject matter was a little heavier. The first 2 books, and I told you, they go through history. And the history actually mirrors what happens here in our community. So the first book, the backstory was post-Revolutionary War, and there were shipwrecks on Lake Ontario, and there was all kinds of things going on with Canada, and somebody gets murdered in the Historical Society Museum, which is run by Ed DeClerk's wife, Annie. And it's related to something that happened in history. They find a map, they find a manuscript. The second book, the person was killed in a cemetery where the casualties of the War of 1812 were buried, and they found an artifact. And then they traveled to England, and it sort of helped them figure out. This one's about the abolition movement and the Underground Railroad. And those are heavier. I mean, they're heavier stories.
Yeah.
And I had to do a lot of research about that. Interestingly, we live in the heart of Seneca Falls is like down the road from us. So the women's movement, we had Frederick Douglass lived in Rochester. We have a lot of that history here. And in our community, we have evidence that there was an Underground Railroad here. During that time, there was a settlement called Maxwell Settlement that housed free people of color and abolitionists, and they helped fleeing slaves go across the Lake Ontario to Canada. That's all true. But I didn't know the full story, so I had to do a lot of research for that. And there are darker stories related to that period of time. In my book, they have the real settlement fell into disrepair in the 1920s. people came back after the war and they settled there, but then they started moving on because they had more freedom to go places. And in my book, the Historical Society gets aggrieved and they restore it. And there's some dark stories about all of that as well. I mean, I don't think the book is darker, but I think it's a more serious topic. And I had to be very careful about that when I was writing it, because it's fiction based on fact.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that I also like what you were saying about, or what you were kind of implying about the fact that you as the author couldn't really step back to recognize what you had achieved until your editor assured you that, this was the best thing you had ever written. And I think that's interesting both for authors and readers to hear. And then that idea of the challenges of making what is supposed to be kind of a light genre, cozy mysteries being a lighter genre, but
they are
accommodating those more serious topics.
And I think what I also learned was don't take anything for granted. That you can maybe do your best and think you're not doing your best, but then critical acclaim comes. That book won an award. There's an organization out of Chicago called the International Firebird Awards, and I submitted it, and I got first place in mysteries and third place in fiction. And again, I never felt like it was my best effort, but everybody else is really liking it. And as I look back, I think part of it is it was more complex because of the secondary plot. And I'll tell you a little bit about that secondary plot. It's very interesting. When I started to write, and this is something else I learned that I can talk about, I had in mind what I wanted it to be, and it's related to the settlement that the grant is restoring that was, a settlement during the abolition movement and the Underground Railroad. And I decided to do a secondary plot sort of based on that, but it's also linked sort of to the murder. And it was a very complex thing to write. And I had in mind what I wanted to do about it. And I literally was almost finished with the book when I decided I didn't like that secondary plot. It was a little too political. And we're not living in times when people want to read cozies that are political.
Yeah.
And I realized that. And when I started out, it wouldn't have been quite as political, but it had become so. So I had to just stop it midstream. And rather than, I think it would have been okay to submit, but I decided I wasn't comfortable submitting it. So I literally had to stop and rewrite that entire subplot.
Wow.
New characters, new everything. And again, what I learned is it's okay to do that. If you're not comfortable as an author with your book and what you're submitting, then don't. And even if it takes a little bit longer, and again, I was in constant communication with my publisher, she was great. I have a wonderful, wonderful publisher. I love working with Cozy Cat Press. And she said, we have plenty of work to do. Get it to me when you feel comfortable. And that was fabulous. It was published in 2022, but at the end of the year rather than at the beginning. But, what I've learned is it's okay to look at your work and not force an issue if it doesn't feel right to you. Not try to make something fit into a plot just because that's the way you started out thinking about it. It's okay to just say, I'm not doing this. But it was a lot of work.
Yeah, that is a great lesson for what you learned that you wanted to share with your fellow authors.
Let me just say one more thing about that, which is I always feel a little intimidated when I hear people, and they've been on your show, and I see them on others who say, I write a book every 3 weeks or 3 months, or I write 6 books a year and so forth. And I'm kind of in awe of that. I can't do that. As I said, I'm a very slow writer and I just can't do it. Plus, I'm retired from my big paying career, and this is also about being with family and taking walks in our beautiful community and being involved in the community. I'm on the library board. I help with some other things. And so I don't have to do it as quickly as long as my publisher's okay. And what I learned is I don't have to compete.
Yes.
That I really don't need to compete with people who write faster. They might write great books. They might write 4 a year, and I don't have to do that. I can write one every 2 years if that's what I want to do. And so I'm much calmer now about the process.
Yeah, and I think that the speed of publication is based not only on how fast an author writes, but what kind of books they're writing. Like the more complexly plotted a book is, just by the nature of it, the longer it's going to take. And so the people who are publishing very rapidly are generally writing in a genre and a style that enables that. So you have to pair the speed of the writing with the kind of writing that's being done. And recognizing that, I think, can also help authors not feel like, they're pulled down by the comparisonitis of people who are publishing more quickly than they are.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. For readers, what I've learned, again, is never to take anything for granted. About a year ago, I did a signing, and there was a woman who I've known for years. She and her husband are historians, and she tends to like historical romances and books just based on history. And she said what really bothers her about some of those books is they're not accurate. And she started questioning me about my books. And she had read the first one, and there was a little history. There wasn't a lot of history. I mean, it was true. And it was very hard for me to explain to her that these books, the subplots are fiction based on fact. I may use Abraham Lincoln's name in the Emancipation Proclamation and the Slave Act in the book, but the characters I create are not real. And I can do that. And I can say that a settlement that we actually had here called Maxwell Settlement, and there was truth that a doctor was the one who developed it. It was true that the people lived here who here were free people of color and abolitionists, and that they helped slaves escape across the Lake Ontario. But it's not true that the place was rebuilt, that there was a grant. I can do that. I'm a fiction writer.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing that it was very hard for her to understand that I don't have to stick to the actual occurrences. I can riff.
Yes.
I mean, that's kind of, and it's interesting too, because even I had to do a lot of research, both on criminal investigations and on the history of this area. And when I started writing the books, one of the things I decided was, even though they're fiction, I want the investigative procedures to be as accurate as possible. So I was very lucky to be invited to participate in a citizens police academy that our county sheriff does. I have a friend who's a professor of criminal justice, and he thought I would love it. He knew about it, and he got me into the class. It was 9 weeks, 4 or 5 hours each time, and we did everything. I mean, we learned about canine. We ate in the prison with the prisoners. I mean, we really did a lot, and I learned a huge amount about that part of it. But I also have a friend who was a retired commander of a big county police department. I know the DA. So I was able to interview all these people and take notes, and they're still my resources if I have a question. I want, when people read the books, when my readers read the books, what I want them to learn or know is that they can pretty much trust the way the investigation is going. And one of the things that somebody said to me was my investigations took too long, because sometimes they go over a period of hours or months. And the commander read the first book. He's read them all, but he said it was spot on. He said, what people don't realize is oftentimes crimes are not solved within 3 days, even though that's what you see on TV or read on movies. And he said, I did that actually very right. That was high praise. So I try to do that. And again, I try to research the occurrences that happen in this community. But what he said to me is, and the DA has said the same thing to me, is you really have to remember that you don't have to be as accurate as possible, but it is fiction.
Yeah. Yeah. I interviewed Bruce Coffin, who's both an author and a retired police detective, about that very topic, about portraying that kind of thing in books. And he said, nobody wants it realistically. Like, then they waited 7 weeks for the results. Like, even he doesn't want to read that in fiction. He appreciates when it's sped up a little bit.
Yeah, you can speed it up. So that's sort of the, fiction based on fact. Yeah. So, that's kind of what I've learned, and what I want my readers to know is that you're reading a lot of fact interspersed with the fiction, but understand that it's not all fact. So
it's not a documentary. It's a piece of
entertainment. And I think what I'm going to do, actually, and I'm working on book 4, and that's rum running and prohibition. And this one's fun for me. I mean, the last one wasn't that much fun. And it was, again, as I said, it was hard to write. And it was a little bit of a darker subject. This one is kind of a hoot, because they're speakeasies and they're monsters. And there's all kinds of stuff as the backstory. But I think what I want to do in my introduction is talk about the fact that this is a piece of fiction based on fact, but that as an author, I took license to change the fact a little bit. And I do in this book. I mean, I'm actually having kind of a lot of fun with this book because my paternal grandfather at one point ran a speakeasy. And it's a very long story, but he didn't start out. He started out with kind of a restaurant pub that sold liquor. And during Prohibition, he couldn't do that. He had a wife and 3 kids to support. And my father didn't find out about it until many years later. And I remember we were talking, and this was towards the end of his life, and we never knew that. I mean, I'm one of 4 siblings. None of us knew that. And he was ashamed that his father had run a speakeasy. And what we said to him is, but he had no, what else was he supposed to do? They tried to run, I guess, a candy store, and that wasn't making it. And so he did in the basement of their old house, which was, it's the second oldest property in Pittsburgh. There's Sport Pit, and then there's what's called the Old Stone Tavern, which was built in the 1700s. It's where my father grew up.
No, no kidding.
Yeah, and he ran a speakeasy, I guess, in the basement. And so I'm kind of using that a little bit in this next book because it's such fascinating history. But my father was embarrassed. And we said, there's nothing to be embarrassed. And my characters in this book aren't going to be embarrassed. They're going to think it's kind of cool.
Well, I'm relieved for you that it sounds like you had a very creatively and critically successful book 3, but I'm happy for you that book 4 is sounding like it's a little bit, proving to be a little bit more fun for you as the author of it. Well, Karen, great lessons that you're sharing for your fellow authors and great insights you're sharing for your fellow readers. So thank you so much for chatting with me about Murder at Freedom Hill. And please let the viewers know where they can go to find out more about you and your books online.
Hey, thank you. Well, there's actually 2 places. One, Amazon really has a lot of information. I have an Amazon authors site. You can order books and it'll take you to the links. I do a blog with Ladies of Mystery. It'll talk about that. So that's probably a really good place to go. And also, if you're local, there's a wonderful magazine called Life in the Finger Lakes, and it's very regional. It's all of upstate New York and covers the Finger Lakes, which we are part of. And they've done several nice articles, features on me in my books. And if you want to go to look at some reviews there, they do an online once a week and then a monthly, bi-monthly. And the last week they did one with all the book signings that I'm doing and book talks in this area over the summer through fall. Nice. So you can go to Life in the Finger Lakes or go to Amazon. And I think those are probably 2 really good places.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on your show. It's been a lot of fun.
Oh, great. Great to hear that.
Yeah, thank you.